Before the blade fell on France's queen, her captors planned a final calculated act of cruelty. Their goal was not just execution, but obliteration. Her journey from the gilded halls of Versailles to a common cart through streets filled with a populace baying for blood aimed to strip away every vestige of her former self. Yet, they did not succeed entirely. This narrative chronicles Marie Antoinette's final hours, detailing the deliberate degradation she endured and the quiet dignity she reclaimed amidst them. Our story begins not in the opulence of the Hall of Mirrors, but in the dank, rat-infested confines of the Conciergerie prison in Paris. This ancient fortress, often called the antechamber to the Guillotine, served as the last stop for many enemies of the French Revolution. On the 2nd of August 1793, Marie Antoinette was brought there alone. Months earlier, she had been imprisoned with her children and sister-in-law. Now she was torn from them entirely. For 76 days, the woman who had once reigned as Queen of France ceased to be a monarch. She was simply prisoner 280. Her cell was a miserable, cramped space. Water perpetually dripped down the walls, and her bed consisted of a single soiled straw mattress. Privacy, a concept she had once known intimately in palaces, was now a forgotten luxury. 2 guards maintained a constant vigil inside her cell, their eyes fixed on her every movement. They watched as she consumed the meagre prison slop. They observed her restless attempts to sleep. They even watched as she struggled to change her clothes, using only a flimsy screen for a semblance of modesty. This unrelenting surveillance was a weapon, a deliberate instrument of dehumanization. For a woman who once commanded private estates and elaborate rituals, it was the ultimate calculated insult. Yet, the physical squalor of her cell paled in comparison to the psychological torment she endured. Just 1 month prior, revolutionary guards had stormed her room at the Temple prison in the dead of night. They had come for her 8-year-old son, Louis Charles. Accounts from the time describe a frantic mother, throwing herself between the guards and her child, pleading with them not to take him. Her teenage daughter, Marie-Thérèse, clung to her brother, screaming in desperation. But the guards were relentless. They tore the young boy from his mother's arms. Marie Antoinette would never see him again. All that remained to her of him was a small portrait and a lock of his hair, carefully hidden in her corset. It was not the loss of her crown that defined these final days, but rather the profound, crushing grief of a mother. Her maid, Rosalie Lamorlière, who attended her in the conciergerie, would later recount that the only times the former queen truly broke down and wept were when she spoke of her children. The pain of their separation was a constant raw wound. It lingered, a silent agony beneath the stoic facade she often presented. In mid-October, the final act of her public life began. On October 14th, 1793, Marie Antoinette was brought before the Revolutionary Tribunal. This was not a trial designed to uncover truth, but a piece of political theatre, its outcome predetermined. Unlike her husband, Louis XVI, who had weeks to prepare a defence, the Queen was afforded less than a single day. The charges levelled against her were a chaotic mix of alleged political conspiracy and sensationalised, often lurid tabloid fantasies. Much of the accusation was drawn directly from the slanderous pamphlets that had demonised her for years. She stood accused of funneling French money to Austria, of plotting massacres against the revolutionaries, and even of hosting depraved orgies at Versailles. But one accusation, delivered with venomous intent, was designed to utterly annihilate her character. It was so vile that it reportedly stunned even some of the hardened revolutionaries present in the courtroom. The prosecution, led by the fanatical Antoine Quentin Fouquier-Tinville, accused her of incest with her own son. They had coerced little Louis Charles, manipulating him to sign a false statement against his mother. For a long moment the Queen remained silent. A low buzz of chatter filled the courtroom. Then she slowly rose to her feet. She did not look at the judges or her accusers. Instead, she turned her gaze towards the gallery, packed with the working-class women of Paris, the very women who had once howled for her death. In a voice that was both clear and unwavering, she addressed them directly. "I appeal to all mothers present in this room." It was a brilliant, unexpected manoeuvre. For a fleeting, stunning moment, she ceased to be the hated Austrian, or Madame. Deficit, she was simply a mother, defending her honour against an unspeakable lie. A palpable shift occurred in the mood of the room. The women in the crowd, mothers themselves, began to murmur in her defence. It was a brief flicker of her old power, a reminder of the woman who once commanded a court with a mere glance. But it was only a flicker. The ultimate verdict was never in doubt. In the early hours of October 16th, after a 2-day proceeding, the all-male jury returned their decision. They found her guilty of high treason. The sentence was immediate death. When asked if she had anything left to say, Marie Antoinette simply shook her head. There was nothing more. Back in her cell after the verdict was delivered, Marie Antoinette refused a final meal. "I need nothing now, my child," she told her maid Rosalie. "Everything is over for me." A quiet resolve settled upon her. She picked up a pen, a small familiar object in a world turned utterly alien, and began to write. Her final letter was addressed to her sister-in-law, Madame Elisabeth. In it she expressed deep regret for the separation from her family. Most heartbreakingly, she begged forgiveness for her young son, knowing he'd been coerced into giving false testimony against her. This poignant message, a mother's last desperate plea for understanding, was never delivered. It was intercepted by her enemies, a final act of cruelty, and would only be discovered years later. As dawn broke over Paris on October the 16th, the physical humiliations began, each meticulously planned to strip her of any lingering vestige of queenship. The guards ordered her to remove the black mourning dress she had worn since her husband's execution. This garment, a silent testament to her status and her recent history, was deemed inappropriate. Instead, they forced her into a threadbare white shift. It was the simple, coarse attire of a penitent, not a queen, a deliberate symbol of her perceived fallen state. To change, she humbly pleaded with a guard to turn his back, if only for a fleeting moment of privacy. He refused, his gaze unwavering, a silent declaration of her utter lack of control. Then came the executioner, Charles-Henri Sanson. One of his assistants stepped forward, roughly seizing a handful of her hair. Once famously piled high and adorned with jewels, it had turned prematurely white from the immense stress of her ordeal. With a pair of rough scissors, he hacked it from her head. This act was deeply symbolic, intended to strip her of her femininity and her former status. It was a brutal public shearing of a woman who had once been the epitome of courtly elegance, yet it also served a practical, gruesome purpose: to ensure a clean, swift cut from the guillotine's blade. Next, they bound her hands cruelly behind her back. "They did not bind my husband's hands," she protested, a rare momentary spark of defiance. Her plea was ignored. The ropes were pulled so tight that they caused her obvious pain digging into her wrists. The physical discomfort was intense, yet her gaze remained firm. Reduced to the most basic human needs, she had to humbly request permission from her captors to relieve herself in a corner of the cell before they led her away. It was a final stark reminder of her lost dignity, an appeal for a momentary respite from surveillance and control. At 11 o'clock that morning, the heavy gates of the conciergerie creaked open. Her husband, King Louis XVI, had been granted the dignity of a closed carriage for his final journey to the scaffold. For the Queen, there would be no such courtesy. A crude, open wooden cart, typically used for common criminals, awaited her. They forced her onto a plank, her hands still tightly bound behind her back, completely exposed to the elements and the throngs of the city. The journey to the Place de la Révolution, known today as the Place de la Concorde, stretched for over an hour. The streets were packed with tens of thousands of people, a vast hostile sea of faces. They jeered, they spat, they screamed insults. The famous revolutionary artist Jacques-Louis David sat on a balcony, sketching her as she passed. His quick charcoal captured her haggard, yet strangely defiant profile. The cart jolted so violently at one point that it almost threw her from her seat, a near fall that could have shattered her composure. Through it all, Marie Antoinette sat ramrod straight. Her face, pale and drawn, remained a proud, unyielding mask. She did not flinch. She did not cry. She simply stared straight ahead, a solitary figure of remarkable composure amidst a hurricane of hate. Her gaze was fixed on a point beyond the angry crowd, beyond the end of her life. Finally, the wooden cart rumbled into the vast expanse of the Place de la Révolution, what we now know as the Place de la Concorde. In the centre of the square stood the guillotine, its tall, ominous frame a stark silhouette against the October sky. The immense crowd surged forward, hungry for the bloody finale they had come to witness. As Marie Antoinette stepped down from the cart, a subtle shift occurred. Despite the relentless campaign to break her, eyewitnesses described her as remarkably calm, composed, almost graceful. She walked towards the wooden steps of the scaffold, refusing the executioner's proffered help. Each step she took was deliberate, unassisted. As she reached the top, in a final bizarre twist of fate, she accidentally stepped on the foot of her executioner, Charles-Henri Sanson. This was the man who had just moments ago cut her hair, bound her hands, and was now mere seconds away from ending her life. For a brief instant, all eyes in the massive square seemed to fixate on them. Without a hint of fear or anger in her voice, she leaned towards him and spoke her final words. They were a quiet, simple apology. "Pardon me, sir. I did not mean to do it." It was an extraordinary moment of grace, a display of innate human decency in the face of monstrous cruelty. That small act of courtesy, offered to the very man who embodied her destruction, was her ultimate, unexpected act of defiance. It was a silent declaration that they could kill her, but they could not destroy who she was, nor strip her of her fundamental humanity. It was a final, private victory in her own terms. At exactly 12:15 in the afternoon, the blade fell. It was swift, efficient, and horrifyingly final. Sanson's assistant, carrying out his grim duty, grabbed her severed head by its white hair and held it high for the massive crowd to see. A massive roar erupted from the thousands gathered, a collective shout of "Long live the Republic!" Her body was unceremoniously loaded back onto the crude cart. It was then transported to a nearby cemetery, where it was thrown into an unmarked mass grave alongside the remains of common criminals. The revolutionaries had truly tried to erase her, burying the last Queen of France like an ordinary citizen, without honours, without ceremony. And here, a final macabre legend emerged, one that has followed her story ever since. It is said that the artist, who would later become famous as Madame Tussaud, was called in to make a death mask from the Queen's severed head. This ghoulish detail, whether true or apocryphal, added another layer to the dark mystique surrounding her end. It would be more than 20 years before her story received its final official chapter. The chaos of the revolution eventually subsided, and the monarchy was eventually restored in France. In 1815, King Louis XVIII, the younger brother of the executed Louis XVI, ordered the exhumation of his brother and sister-in-law. Their remains, painstakingly identified through what meagre evidence remained, were finally accorded a proper royal burial. They were laid to rest in the Basilica of Saint-Denis, the ancient, revered final resting place of French kings and queens for centuries. It was a posthumous recognition, a quiet reclamation of her royal status, long after the revolutionary fervour had faded. The French Revolution had set out with a clear objective: to destroy a symbol of royal excess, of aristocratic privilege that they believed had crushed the common people. They subjected Marie Antoinette to every humiliation imaginable, stripping her of her title, separating her from her family, attempting to obliterate her dignity, and finally taking her life. They wanted the world to see a monster, a decadent queen who deserved her fate. But in those very last moments, with a quiet apology directed towards her own executioner, she denied them their ultimate victory. They took her crown and they took her head, but they could not take the astonishing dignity she displayed before the blade fell. She redefined her end on her own terms. The guillotine's sharp fall was meant to be the final word, a thunderous exclamation mark on the revolutionary narrative. But history, like life, rarely allows for such neat conclusions. Marie Antoinette's death was not an ending, but a new beginning for her legacy, a complex tapestry woven from fact, legend, and enduring human fascination. Her image, once a caricature of extravagance and disdain, began to subtly shift in the decades that followed. The initial revolutionary propaganda, portraying her as the epitome of all evil, slowly gave way to a more nuanced, often tragic understanding. Writers, artists, and even ordinary citizens started to look beyond the political rhetoric, seeing a woman, a mother, facing an unspeakable end. The stories of her composure in those final hours, particularly the small human act of apologizing to her executioner, began to circulate. These anecdotes, initially whispered, then openly recounted, stood in stark contrast to the monstrous image the revolutionaries had tried so hard to cement. They spoke of resilience, of a spirit unbroken by the most extreme degradation. This re-evaluation was not immediate or universal. For generations, the name Marie Antoinette remained synonymous with aristocratic excess and the detachment of the Ancien Régime, yet a counter-narrative, one emphasizing her suffering and her surprising fortitude, quietly gained ground. Her final act of grace resonated with the universal human truth that even in the face of absolute powerlessness, a flicker of dignity can remain. The discovery and eventual publication of her final letter to Madame Elizabeth further cemented this shift. Its heartfelt plea for her son's forgiveness, born of a mother's profound grief, offered a glimpse into her inner world, a world far removed from the cold, calculating tyrant she was often depicted as. The letter painted a picture of sorrow, love, and a desperate hope for her family's future, not defiant monarch. Over time, her personal tragedies, the loss of her children, the isolation, the constant surveillance, began to overshadow the political charges. She became a symbol not just of a fallen monarchy, but of ultimate victimhood, a woman crushed by forces beyond her control. This transformation was aided by romantic interpretations of history, often penned by later generations who could afford the luxury of empathy without the immediate threat of the guillotine. The meticulous preservation of her remains, orchestrated by Louis XVIII, was more than just a royal prerogative. It was a conscious effort to rewrite her place in history, to restore her to the dignity of a queen, albeit one who met a tragic end. The burial in Saint-Denis was a silent rebuttal to the mass grave, a formal reassertion of her identity against the revolutionary attempt to erase it. Today, Marie Antoinette continues to captivate. Her story is retold in countless books, films, and documentaries. She is no longer just a figure of historical condemnation or blind adulation, but a complex character at the epicenter of a world-changing event. Her trials and tribulations, her fashion, her perceived aloofness, and ultimately her extraordinary final moments are endlessly debated and reinterpreted. What remains undeniable is the enduring power of her last stand. The revolutionaries sought to destroy a symbol and to set an example. They succeeded in ending her life and, for a time, tarnishing her image. But they failed to break her spirit in the way they intended. The quiet apology on the scaffold became her unintended triumph, an eloquent testament to the human capacity for dignity, even when all else is lost. Her story is a stark reminder that even the most reviled figures can find unexpected grace, and that history itself is a narrative constantly being rewritten. Marie Antoinette, the queen who lost her crown and her head, ultimately found an enduring place in the collective memory, not solely as a victim or a villain, but as a woman who in her final breath clung fiercely to her humanity. Her quiet words to her executioner echo through time, a testament to the fact that while power can destroy life, it cannot always conquer the human spirit.